Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's Advent meditation. And thank you all very much for being here with me. I really do appreciate your support. If you're lucky enough, like me, you can hear the organ being played in the church. Currently playing Sound the Trumpets, one of the most magnificent, most gloriously God-celebrating pieces of music I've heard in a long time. It's down for my funeral, which hopefully won't be too soon. And on that subject, please, folks, the COVID numbers are very, very high. Please don't take any risks. Please just rest at home. Spend time with God. This is a good time to do it, and while you keep yourself safe. I really don't want to hear of anyone being ill. So today is week 3 and day 3 of Advent 1921. And we are going to read a passage from Isaiah 11 verses 1 to 9. Sorry, I'm sitting in the wind because it's extremely hot inside. And this passage is some of the most beautiful poetry, and I'm so happy to share it with you. And I love Isaiah, and I think I've said to you before, especially the first part of Isaiah. You know, Isaiah is actually broken into 3 parts. That would be Proto-Isaiah or First Isaiah, which is chapters 1 to 33. And that part of Isaiah, we know that he did write himself. We're not so sure of part 2 and 3. Part 2 is Deutero-Isaiah, and the last one is the one I always forget. Anyway, it's Isaiah 3. I just cannot remember that last one for the life of me. So the first one, which we know that he wrote, the writing is really, really beautiful. If you haven't ever read it, just go and pick some of the main passages, and this one in particular is really beautiful. So it's called The Branch from Jesse, and I will read it for you. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy, with justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth and with the breath of his lips. He will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. The wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear. Their young will lie down together. And the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put his hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy. On all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So let's just go back and perhaps we take a kind of long distance helicopter view just to begin with. So what's happening here? So if you go to Isaiah 10, at the end, towards the end, you will see that what comes before this is that Assyria has attacked northern Israel. Now, I don't know how many of you know the story or the history of how Israel was formed, but in the very beginning, it was, and we're talking about 10,000 years BC to about 8,000 years BC, I think. Okay. Israel was one nation, and the northern part, which was the bigger part, was called Israel, and the little bit at the south, which contained Jerusalem, was called Judah. And the Assyrians fought and overran northern Israel. And that's quite significant because, and God allowed it, because the Israelites were behaving so badly. They were worshipping false gods. They were living lives of incredible sexual immorality, and they had just completely forgotten about their spirituality, their religion, their promises to God. So he allowed the Assyrians to overrun northern Israel and to destroy it. And so it was taken away from the Israelites. And interesting because, northern Israel was the most dominant and the biggest. The Israel was populated by the 12 tribes of Israel, who were the sons of Jacob. And 10 of those tribes, 10 of those sons and their tribes lived in northern Israel. And only 2 of them stayed in Judah, one of which was Benjamin. I don't remember the second one. So it left, kind of like a remnant. And you often hear the people who came back from Babylon after the Babylonians conquered Israel, conquered Jerusalem. And many years later, they're also called the remnant. And the remnant is considered to be God's chosen. So what happens in the beginning of this passage, this scripture, is that this battle has happened, and there's complete desolation and destruction everywhere. And Isaiah is prophesying how this will be restored, how God's chosen will be restored. So that's the first part. And then because Jerusalem has become incredibly corrupt, exactly as northern Israel did, he also prophesies how life will be when when Jesus arrives and the people revert and give up their sins and act as the hands and feet of God in the world, what that will look like. And reminds me very much of the coming of Jerusalem, the new kingdom in Revelation, at the end of Revelation. And then they obviously they go through all these things of what it would look like, and I'll remind you later. And the earth is just going to be filled with the knowledge of the Lord, and he's sure enough of that as sure he is of the fact that the waters will cover the sea. Okay. So the very, very first line is the promise, and this is where it reminds us of Christmas, and it reminds us of Advent, and why is this reading happening in Advent? Well, because of this reminder. And he says, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. Now, Jesse was David's father, King David's father. Well-known Christmas carol, that Jesus comes from David's line. I can't remember the whole line now. I haven't sung for such a long time. So there's the promise, okay, that, after this destruction of how things are going to be healed. And so from his roots, a branch will bear fruit. And immediately, my mind goes to the passage, and I think it's in John, I'm pretty sure it's in John, towards the middle of John, where he talks about the vine. And Jesus says, "You are the vine, and I'm the branches." And I am the vine, and you are the branches. Sorry. And so this imagery comes back to me when I read this, and that's happening years later in the New Testament. They're still picking up on that imagery of a branch and fruit being born. And what's interesting to me, and I've never noticed it before, but I've done a lot of reading lately in the wisdom tradition. And the word wisdom is mentioned so many times here, and also the reference to the spirit is very, very frequent. And the wisdom teachings are really quite wonderful. We don't often get access to the wisdom of God. And it's just so important in our lives. And I can't explain it here, it will take too long. But I'm interested that it is referred to here, and yet the churches haven't picked up on it. So what does he say of what it's going to look like? He says firstly that Jesus is going to come and the Spirit of the Lord will be resting on him. The Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might. So here you see that, and Jesus was called by the Jews a Moshalem, I think the word is, and that means a wisdom father of wisdom. So he will have the spirit of wisdom, the spirit of counsel and might, and the spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord. In other words, not being afraid of the Lord, but understanding the Lord and respecting the Lord. And I said to you earlier when we did that little summary that Jerusalem had gone very corrupt, just like northern Israel had. And they were living lives of corruption, of fraud, of corruption of the law, finding people guilty and punishing them, normally the poor people, the marginalized people, so that some other person could get away. And then Isaiah prophesies that he says, this person, the Lord, who comes from the root of Jesse, will not judge with his eyes or with what he hears with his ears. So he's not going to use his own personal judgment. He's going to use his wisdom and his righteousness, and he will judge for the needy. He will give them a break. So he's going to come, and with his wisdom, he is going to correct all the corruption of the past, and fairness and righteousness will flow from his decisions and his teachings. He's girded with righteousness as his belt and faithfulness as the sash around his waist. So these are the things that gird him and keep him strong. And then he goes on to say what the world would be like. And it's really a beautiful picture. Things like the wolf will live with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together. And then things like the child will put his hand into the cobra's nest and he will be unharmed, because nothing that God creates will ever harm or destroy anything. Yes, and then he reassures us and says, that this is surely will happen, as sure as the waters cover the sea. Okay. So we might ask, what does this mean for Advent, and what, what can I use it for in this Advent time? Well, this is a very specific and clear reflection that is in this passage, and that is really about justice and righteousness and fairness. And do we in our lives act with judgment, with righteousness and fairness? Or are we judging people unfairly? And I think, that my mind immediately goes to things like racism and gender bias and all the isms, that divide us. And how guilty are we of those isms? How often do we put ourselves ahead of something else and think that we are better than another race or another gender or another culture? Um, because that is sinful, because we are all born in the image of God and we are all born equal. And it's up to us as people of God to be the hands and feet of Jesus in the world, to be, he says there that, it's not just sin, it's not just confessing our sin and saying we're sorry, but we have to act in the world. We have to act as as righteous people. We have to bring about healing as Jesus did, to people who have been marginalized and used as targets to set other people free. They were just not seen as real people. I just want to pick up in the next verse. I don't want to waste too much time. But yeah, in terms of our Advent reflection, where in our lives are we judging unfairly? We shouldn't judge at all. We shouldn't. We are told that we do not judge, God judges. We leave the judgment to God because God is the only person who knows the full picture. A murderer, we all say, that's terrible, yes, he must go to jail, throw away the key, but we don't know anything about that person and what circumstances led them to committing that murder. And then sometimes, 30 years later, you hear all these stories coming out of America where these black people have been judged by white supremacists, white racists, and sent to jail. And it's coming out now, people, their whole lives have been ruined. They're coming out in their 50 or 60, their family, they don't have their family. They have nothing because they were wrongly accused and wrongly convicted by people who judged unrighteously and unfairly. I know that's quite an extreme example, but we just look closely at our own lives. Where do we do that? Where do we catch ourselves? Catch ourselves. I often do, and my husband is the most wonderful sort of person who controls it. And I will say something, so-and-so did this and what this and this and that. And he'll say, no, hang on a minute. Maybe that wasn't the reason. Maybe there is another reason. Maybe there's a good reason why they did what they did. And we tend to judge, to jump to conclusions, and then we judge people based on those conclusions when we actually don't have the information. So we need to act with compassion and kindness to everybody because that is what the Lord calls us to do, and allow Him to do the judging. It's not for us. So that's your reflection. Where do I judge unfairly? Be honest with yourself, because we all do. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make His face to shine upon you. May you know His favor and His wonderful, completely incomprehensible peace. Please walk safely in the world. Amen.